Most people were taught that in August 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television to announce a macroeconomic adjustment. You were probably told it was a necessary modernization of the global monetary system, a temporary suspension to fight inflation and stabilize the American economy. But if you look past the political rhetoric and open the ledger books of the United States Treasury, you will find a much colder reality. This was not a calculated economic policy designed by brilliant academics. It was the largest sovereign default in human history. How does the most powerful empire on earth, holding the world's reserve currency, simply break its biggest financial promise in an 18-minute television broadcast? To answer that, we cannot look at the political speeches. We have to look at the gold reserves, the short-term debt, and the moment a superpower realized it was running out of collateral. To understand the collapse, we have to go back to the promise that built the modern American empire. In 1944, as World War II was tearing Europe apart, delegates from 44 nations gathered in a quiet hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The old world was burning, and a new financial order was being drawn on paper. At that moment, the United States held nearly two-thirds of the world's monetary gold. Fort Knox was overflowing with physical bullion, a mountain of wealth unmatched in human history. So, America made a proposition to the exhausted nations of the world. Tie your currencies to the US dollar, and we will tie the dollar to gold. The rate was mathematically locked in. $35 would always equal exactly 1 ounce of physical gold. It was a bedrock guarantee, signed in ink. The world trusted the dollar because they believed it was just a paper receipt for a piece of yellow metal sitting safely in an American vault. For 2 decades, this system fueled the greatest economic expansion in modern history. Global trade flowed smoothly. European empires rebuilt their shattered cities, using American credit. But there was a fatal flaw built into this credit empire. The system only worked if the United States printed only as many dollars as it had gold to back them up. And empires rarely know how to stop printing. By the 1960s, the American ledger began to bleed. The surface of history shows a nation engaged in a Cold War ideological struggle and domestic reform. But the hidden chapter is a story of a balance sheet, stretched beyond its absolute breaking point. President Lyndon B. Johnson wanted to build the Great Society at home, a massive, multi-billion-dollar expansion of domestic welfare programs. At the exact same time, half a world away, the jungles of Vietnam were consuming immense amounts of capital. Military hardware, supply lines, and human lives were burning through the national budget. You can fund a domestic agenda with taxes. You can fund a war with taxes, but you cannot fund both simultaneously without running massive, unsustainable deficits. Instead of raising taxes to unpopular levels, the government turned to the printing press. The Federal Reserve began to quietly flood the global financial system with paper dollars. These dollars flowed overseas, paying for military bases in Europe, defense contractors in Asia, and imported goods for American consumers. By the late 1960s, a dangerous, undeniable gap had opened up. There were billions of paper dollars circulating around the globe, but the amount of physical gold inside Fort Knox was steadily shrinking. The promise of $35 for an ounce of gold was no longer a mathematical guarantee. It was becoming a bluff, a lie, written on the sovereign ledger. People think that America was trapped in Vietnam by military sunk costs and political pride. But the financial documents reveal they were trapped in a spiraling vortex of war debt. In the world of international finance, bluffs are eventually called, and the people who called the American bluff were not Soviet adversaries. They were America's closest allies. Across the Atlantic, French President Charles de Gaulle was watching the American printing press with growing suspicion. De Gaulle realized that the United States was buying real European factories, real French goods, and fighting a real war, using paper money that was increasingly backed by nothing. He famously called it an exorbitant privilege. So, France decided to test the system. The French government began sending naval vessels across the Atlantic, carrying stacks of paper dollars, demanding physical gold in return. It was a polite, diplomatic bank run, and it terrified the Treasury Department in Washington. As the French repatriated their gold, other nations quietly looked at their own ledgers and followed suit. Spain, Italy, and West Germany began converting their massive dollar reserves. The gold in Fort Knox plummeted from over 20,000 tons at the end of World War II to less than 10,000 tons by the early 1970s. The vault was emptying out, day by day. But the final, fatal blow did not come from Paris. In August 1971, the British ambassador to the United States made a quiet, urgent request to the Treasury. The Bank of England wanted to convert $3 billion into physical gold. Britain, America's most trusted partner, was asking for the collateral. The United States did not have the gold to pay them. The credit empire was officially insolvent. When a nation cannot pay its debts, it faces a brutal choice. It can endure a crippling austerity, shrink its military footprint, and admit to the world that its empire is overextended. Or it can simply change the rules of the game. On Friday, August 13, 1971, President Richard Nixon quietly boarded a helicopter for Camp David. He did not invite the Secretary of State. He did not consult the leaders of Britain, France, or West Germany. He did not call the international bankers who relied on the Bretton Woods system. He gathered a small, tight circle of economic advisors, led by Treasury Secretary John Connolly. Inside the secluded cabins of Camp David, surrounded by dense Maryland woods, the fate of the global economy was decided in absolute secrecy. Connolly, a pragmatic and ruthless politician from Texas, argued that the United States should not sacrifice its domestic economy to save an international system. His logic was cold and purely transactional. If we don't have the gold, we simply stop giving it out. There was no grand diplomatic negotiation. There was no treaty signed in a European palace. It was a defensive maneuver, drafted on legal pads behind closed doors, to stop a run on the bank. On Sunday evening, August 15th, Nixon went on national television. He announced that he was directing the Secretary of the Treasury to temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. He called it a temporary measure. It was never temporary. With a few spoken sentences, Nixon severed the millennia-old link between money and precious metal. The Bretton Woods Agreement, a treaty that defined the post-war world, was ripped up unilaterally. John Connolly would later famously tell a room full of shocked European finance ministers, "The dollar is our currency, but it is your problem." History books often treat the Nixon shock as a dry chapter in macroeconomics, a technical shift from fixed to floating exchange rates. But let's look at the human cost, the price paid by millions of people who were never invited to Camp David. When you sever money from a physical anchor, it becomes fiat currency, money backed by nothing but the violence and taxation power of the state. For governments, it was the ultimate financial liberation. Without the strict constraint of gold, politicians could print endless amounts of money to fund endless wars and endless deficits. But for the working class, it was a quiet financial disaster. Throughout the 1970s, the world was engulfed in massive, crushing inflation. The purchasing power of the paper dollar collapsed, eating away at the savings of ordinary families. Look at the economic charts starting in 1971. Before that year, worker productivity and worker wages rose together, locked in tandem for decades. But after 1971, the lines diverge entirely. Productivity continued to skyrocket as technology advanced, but real wages, adjusted for inflation, completely flatlined. The wealth of the middle class was slowly siphoned away through the invisible tax of inflation. Meanwhile, the prices of hard assets, real estate, stocks, and commodities exploded. The modern era of extreme wealth inequality was born in that secret Camp David meeting. The people standing in gas lines in the late 1970s, the families watching their pensions evaporate, they were paying the hidden war debt of an empire that refused to balance its ledger. When we look back at the global financial architecture we live in today, it is easy to assume it was designed by brilliant economists, a master plan for a modern, interconnected world. But the archival documents tell a much darker story. The system of floating fiat currencies was not a grand design. It was a panic button. It was the desperate improvisation of an empire, caught writing checks it could no longer cash. They didn't modernize the system. They defaulted on their promise and forced the rest of the world to accept the new terms at gunpoint. Sometimes, the most profound geopolitical shifts do not happen on a battlefield. They happen when a treasury vault echoes empty, and a superpower decides that the rules no longer apply to them. You've seen how an empire can rewrite the rules of wealth overnight. What do you think is the true source of a nation's power? Is it the strength of its military on the battlefield, or its ability to print a currency that the rest of the world is forced to accept? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.